Start.
Hello, welcome. So glad you're here joining us. If you're on the Zoom or if you're watching later, I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian at the John Carter Brown Library and professor here in the History Department at Brown University. And I'm so glad to welcome you to this second in our series of resources for our initiative on journalism and history for 2026, when the revolution is news. We've been thinking a lot about how we can help support work of people who are writing and teaching and thinking about the American Revolution in this extraordinary commemorative year. And this effort is one piece of that. You're going to be hearing more from us throughout the year on this, and you will also be directed, probably if you're watching this video, to some of our earlier work interviewing journalists Jamel Bowie, John Dickerson, Jenny Schussler, and then a panel of expert historians who work with journalists a lot, which is one of the earlier kind of series in this big project. So for today, it is such a pleasure and an honor to get to introduce Rick Atkinson. So Rick is, I'm sure, introduced about every other day at this point, but we'll see if I can manage to say something new, maybe not. Rick is the New York Times bestselling author of 8 narrative histories about 5 American wars. He writes big books, and he does seem to write in threes. I have the first 2 books of his trilogy on the American Revolution. I should say, Rick was a prize-winning journalist before he turned to writing history full-time. The first volume of his trilogy about the liberation of Europe in World War II, An Army at Dawn, the War in North Africa, 1942 to 43, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. And I feel quite lucky that he turned his attention to the revolution for this trilogy, which began in 2020 with The British Are Coming. And of course, his most recent book, the second volume, The Fate of the Day, The War for America, Fort Ticonderoga to Charleston, 1777 to 1780, was released in 2025 at #1 on the New York Times list. And I love this. The reviewer for the Times declared there is no better writer of narrative history than Rick. So obviously, as we were thinking about this series, and I knew we wanted somebody to cover war, the American Revolution, it turns out it was a war. We would like someone to talk about war. So who better than Rick? And I'm very grateful that when I asked, he agreed. So Rick is going to talk to us about war. Then I'm going to ask him some questions, and we'll take your questions via the Q&A. Rick.
Okay, thank you, Karin. We've been friends for quite some time now, and I really admire everything you do, including this project. And thanks to the Brown Library for the opportunity to participate in this extended conversation. I've been writing about war all my professional life for almost 50 years now, God help me. First as a journalist, notably at the Washington Post, as a national reporter, a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent in Somalia and Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. But for the past quarter century, I've been a recovering journalist. And I have written now 8 narrative nonfiction books about 5 different American wars. And as Karin said, the most recent books are the first 2 volumes in the Revolution trilogy, and I've now started researching the 3rd and final volume. So first, sort of big picture, why war? It's not because I like it. I've seen enough of it to really dislike it. But it's part of the warp and woof of American history from colonial days through the current grease fire in the Middle East. 12 generals have become president of the United States, although only 3 are what we would consider professional military officers: Washington, Grant, and Eisenhower. And of course, war is part of the warp and woof of human history, generally. The historians Will and Ariel Durant calculated, and this was in 1968, I believe, that in the past 3.5 millennia, 3,500 years, only 268 years have passed in which there was not a war in progress somewhere. So roughly from the time of the Minoan heyday, people have been at war. I would argue that there are lessons from that long, sad tale applicable in 2026, lessons that in some cases would be recognizable to Thucydides. For example, a lifetime of looking at war persuades me that the first and most important principle is that it never goes the way you think it's going to go. Very occasionally, it goes better than you might dare hope, like the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91, but more typically it goes sideways and spirals into something unforeseen. And that's certainly true of the American Revolution for all parties involved, the American patriots, American loyalists, British, Germans, French, and so on. And I'll come back to some of the issues of relevant lessons. But for now, I'd add that I write about war because it is a great revealer of character. All of my books are about they're character driven, and the extraordinary stress of combat reveals character the way a prism refracts light to show the inner spectrum. That's why it intrigues me. So the general setting of warfare in the 18th century, and specifically focusing on the American Revolution, and the backdrop for the war we call the Revolution, is the four dynastic wars that were fought across nearly a century between Britain and France. The first three are largely irresolute. Nothing earth-shattering or regime-changing emerges from them, but the fourth had profound consequences. And that's the 7 Years' War, or as we call it in America, the French and Indian War. The creation of the first British Empire comes out of the 7 Years' War, and it affects what happens subsequently, notably the Revolution, in a number of ways. For one thing, the British are deeply in debt. The French and the Spanish, who have lost significantly in the 7 Years' War, are humiliated. The Americans have been accustomed to tending to their own affairs for the better part of a century. A kind of benign neglect has been British policy up until we get to 1763 or so. And now benign neglect is no longer British policy. For one thing, they've decided that they're going to try and recoup some of the money that has caused them to go into debt, and they're going to begin taxing the colonists. It's very minor taxes by British standard, and yet the colonists have no voice in it. And that's one of the many grievances that they've got. Also, the colonists, let's say us, don't have to worry about the French anymore. The French and their Indian allies for the better part of a century have been launching raids from Canada down into New England, and it has been a perpetual smoldering fire. And with the French having surrendered Canada to the British, as well as a 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachians, as well as some of the rich sugar islands in the West Indies, where the real money is, as well as parts of India and so on, the French are not really in the picture anymore as a threat to the Americans. There are grievances, there are resentments, there are misunderstandings, and it all leads to gunplay on April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord. And the result is an 8-year war in which at least 25,000 American patriots die for the cause. It's probably many more than that. It's a larger proportion of our population to die in any of our wars other than the Civil War. The image that many Americans have today of the Revolution is something gauzy and benign and bloodless, kind of a faded lithograph quality to it, as if the war was conducted by Currier and Ives. It's not that way at all. It's violent, ugly. It's civil war with many atrocities committed by both sides, and the atrocities get more atrocious the deeper into the war we go. And it's a civil war on several levels between the mother country and American colonists, between American rebels and American loyalists who don't want independence and who comprise perhaps 20% of the 2 million white Americans. There are 2.5 million Americans in 1775. 500,000 of them were enslaved blacks. And it's a civil war between Native American tribes, notably the Six Nations of the Iroquois, who've been getting along quite well for generations, and they're forced to choose sides. And 4 of those nations, those tribes, align with the British and 2 with American rebels. So we've got this civil war playing out on a number of levels. And civil wars always have a special kind of malignancy to them. And the American Revolution is no different. Also, what had been a brush fire insurgency on the far edge of the Atlantic world metastasizes into a global war. It's no longer just fought on the littoral of the American colonies. It's going to be fought on 4 continents and the 7 seas. And it's going to involve first the French, and then the Spanish, and then the Dutch, all of whom are active participants against the British. And we'll talk about Britain's lack of allies in a minute. And then there are other colonial or European powers that are involved, if not overtly, then covertly. And these include the Russians, the Swedes, the Danes. It's hard to find a country in Europe that doesn't have some stake in it. So this raises the stakes for Britain in particular. Unlike modern war, unlike what we see in Iran today, for example, killing in the 18th century was usually intimate, at very close range, face to face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because 18th century muskets, which hadn't changed much in a couple centuries, were mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards or so and almost hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, in the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 or so actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world, the famous shot heard round the world, probably missed. On the other hand, massed musket fire by clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs flying downrange at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. A 1-ounce lead bullet could literally stop a charging bull. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall, which was about average for 18th century males, had an exterior surface of 2,550 square inches, of which 1,000 were exposed to gunfire when he was facing an enemy frontally at close range. That's a big target when swarms of bullets are flying. And given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which is hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're shot in the head, the chance of survival is even more remote. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh, right? American marksmen, especially those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets, but they were harder to load. They couldn't carry a bayonet. They learned to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. And in the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. It gives an idea of the extraordinary violence of some of these battles. The British Army is relatively small. It's about 50,000 troops in 1775. Hence the reliance, as they have relied in earlier wars, on 30,000 German mercenaries, the Hessians. More than half of the British Army will be in North America at one point or another. Officers are largely, although not exclusively, drawn from the aristocracy, British aristocracy. They tend to be younger sons who aren't going to inherit the earldom. This is partly to ensure their loyalty to the crown, and it's partly to give them jobs. Enlisted sign on for life, although that's modified as the revolution proceeds and enlistment recruitment difficulties mount, where there is a time limit put on. You can enlist for the duration of the revolution or for several years, and you don't have to sign on for life. talk about the American forces for just a minute. The Continental Army is formed in the summer of 1775, and it is supplemented by militias, state militias, who are part-time citizen soldiers called out for temporary duty, often to reinforce the Continentals. Militia units tend to be inadequately trained and insufficiently disciplined. They are a cross to bear for General Washington throughout the Revolution. He often has nothing good to say about them. They often ran at the first whiff of gunpowder. But the militias perform many important ancillary duties besides fighting, including things like guarding prisoners and enforcing loyalty to the patriot cause. The militia, especially in the South, but not exclusively in the South, they are the Taliban of the American Revolution. They can be extraordinarily violent and persuasive, and not in a good way. And Washington underestimates their contribution on the battlefield. When the war shifts to the South, as it does almost exclusively in the last couple of years of the Revolution, the war is fought largely by militias, and they have shown themselves by this point to be pretty capable and quite ferocious in battle. There are also loyalist units. Tens of thousands fight for the crown, making this, of course, our first Civil War. It's difficult to overstate the consequences of this. It makes the war much more complicated. It makes the war much nastier. And then there are international forces, soldiers of fortune. Of course, there are a lot of those who drift across the Atlantic to America, and they're going to show up in one form or another. Some of them are very important to the American cause. Some of them are just a trouble for Washington and Congress and others. And then the French are going to send first a fleet that's not very effective under an admiral named D'Estaing, who had been a general. Only the French would take a general and make him into an admiral. He doesn't know how to sail, and he's unlucky. Napoleon most cherished the trait of luck in his generals, and D'Estaing is unlucky. But then they're later in the war going to send both an army under General Rochambeau, and they're going to send a real admiral with a real fleet, Admiral de Grasse, and they're going to be war winning, as it turns out. And then, as I mentioned, the Spanish are going to be involved. The Spanish, particularly, are going to provide naval forces. They're not especially good, but there's a lot of them, and they cause difficulty for the British. And then the Dutch are going to get involved, and the Dutch, of course, have been a seafaring people for a long time. And then there's others that I mentioned who are going to mainly complicate British war making, because they have to always be looking over their shoulder at the Russians and the Swedes and the Danes. Also, and we can talk about this more, both sides are going to recruit Native Americans to fight for them. The British are more successful at it than the Americans, but the Americans do have Native Americans fighting for them. And both sides, to some extent, recruit blacks to fight, both enslaved and otherwise. That is a complicated story. It's an unhappy story. And we can go into that in greater detail as you like. So, what other combat arms are in play in this latter stretch of the 18th century? Artillery, yes, but artillery has not yet in warfare become the dominant killing arm. The king of battle, as artillery will be known in the 19th and especially the 20th century, partly because range and accuracy are limited. A cannonball skipping along the ground can ruin your day. But there are no devastating barrages that kill every exposed enemy soldier along the front, as there will be in later wars. There's also cavalry. Jefferson says that Washington is the greatest horseman of his age. He looks fantastic on a horse, but he doesn't really know how to use cavalry very well. He never really figures it out, partly because the terrain in the north, where he is conducting most of the war, uh, during the first several years of the war doesn't lend itself to cavalry. There are too many fences, and the trees are too close together. It's quite limited in the first years of the war. Uh, it restricts mounted warfare, uh, although when the war shifts to the south, cavalry is going to be more important. And although the British Army typically has 4,000 horses, this is an issue for the British. They need those horses not only for scouting and because no self-respecting officer can be seen on foot. He's got to be mounted on a horse. And they need the horses to pull their supply wagons. They need them to pull their artillery carriages and so on. It's a problem because each one of those horses eats 20 pounds of hay and oats a day. And forage is a persistent restricting problem for both sides, but especially for the British. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I'll also mention naval warfare without lingering on it. The Royal Navy is the greatest navy the world has ever seen. And at one point in the Revolution, about a third of the entire British fleet, the entire Navy, is on station in North American waters. And the Royal Navy is undermanned and undershipped, which is actually a word, early in the war, but they are going to begin building ships in a hurry as the war progresses, and particularly once the French come into it, because the French have a big fleet of their own. The American Congress creates the Continental Navy and orders the construction of 13 frigates, not one of which will survive the war. The Continental Navy is really not a factor. John Paul Jones notwithstanding, he is the exception that proves the rule, essentially. But supplementing navies for both sides, for all sides, really, are privateers. And these are essentially legalized pirates who, in the case of the Americans, have been authorized either by Congress or by individual states to prey on enemy shipping. Britain has the largest merchant fleet in the world. It's a major source of British prosperity. There are about 8,000 British merchant ships, and about 6,000 of those British commercial vessels are involved in overseas trade and supply operations during the Revolution. More than half of those 6,000 ships, the number is about 3,500, were captured, sunk, or ransomed by the Americans and their allies, including the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, mostly by privateers. That's a big problem for the British. Insurance rates skyrocket. The difficulty of protecting merchant shipping complicates the Royal Navy's task almost from the beginning of the war. And in the end, with most of Europe's navies aligned against Britain, the Royal Navy is outnumbered and overstretched. And it's going to be one of the reasons that Britain loses the war. I'll talk about something that's less sexy than naval gunnery, but General Omar Bradley, who was a famous World War II general, eventually a five-star general, is credited with saying that amateurs talk about tactics while professionals talk about logistics. It's vital in every war, and it's certainly vital in the Revolution. Logistics is especially important and especially difficult in expeditionary warfare, a campaign in which you have to travel some distance to fight, as the British did in the Revolution, as we did in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or now Iran. British officials and commanders underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail for 8 years, as it turned out. They failed to foresee the difficulty of feeding tens of thousands of redcoats and German soldiers deployed in North America, as well as those 4,000 horses who were consuming all those tons of hay and oats every year. About 20,000 tons of hay and oats. That takes a lot of shipping. Because foraging expeditions in America, when the British would send out scouting parties to gather hay and oats and whatever else they could feed to their horses, they inevitably got ambushed by aroused rebels, so that nearly all of their supplies, from flour and salt meat and fodder to candles and musket balls and opium, had to be shipped from England or Ireland, a voyage that could take at least 3 months, even if it wasn't disrupted by rebel privateers or Atlantic storms. The British commissary general, who was in charge of supplies, wrote to London from occupied Philadelphia in late 1777, and he said, "We can expect no supplies or assistance from this country. We cannot with safety go 100 yards beyond our lines without a large escort." And by large, he meant thousands of soldiers. That's a very large patrol, just going out to try to harvest some wheat to feed, convert to flour to feed your troops. This, again, is a persistent, difficult problem for the British. Logistics is always hard in war, and it's hard for the Americans, too. Of the 75 official letters that General Washington writes in January and February of 1776, half of them mention munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, especially gunpowder, which he just calls the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead, and by the summer of 1776, the Americans are desperately short of the stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets and clocks and window sash cords are collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, it's more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, Americans imported 15 million bushels annually, half from the West Indies, half from Britain or Southern Europe. But the British trade embargo strangled 2/3 of those imports. To encourage salt works along the Atlantic coast, pamphlets were printed with salt-making recipes. John Adams wrote, "All the old women and children are going down to the Jersey shore to make salt." But 400 gallons of seawater were needed to boil off a bushel of salt, which required huge stacks of firewood. Virginia spent 6,000 pounds, that's a lot of money in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay, but they collected, in the end, only 50 bushels. It's probably the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Well, those problems, and they were substantial, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats, which soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles. The daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat, a gill is 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month, which gives you some idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. It required an enormous amount of shipping space. Of 40 British transport vessels dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76 carrying supplies, only 8 of those 40 ships reached the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain or blown to the West Indies or were intercepted by rebel marauders. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776, and they asked London to send 950 more horses to pull those artillery carriages and the supply wagons, 412 of the 950 horses sent from Britain died at sea during the voyage, and scores more were ruined beyond use. It turns out it's really hard to send horses transatlantically. Horses don't do well being shipped long distances by sea. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Well, I'll jump ahead to the end for a minute and talk about some of the lessons that we can draw from this and some of the consequences. Obviously, the shooting part of the war pretty well comes to an end, although not completely, with the Battle of Yorktown and the British surrender at Yorktown in October 1781. That uh, defeat had a shattering effect on British domestic politics because at this point, it's been 6 years, more than 6 years of war. The coalition that has held together for the king, the king's ministers, substantial majorities in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, that has really now come unstitched. Lord George Germain, who's the American secretary, he's the Robert McNamara of the war for the British, the former British Army general. He tells the House of Commons in November of 1781, when word arrives of the calamity at Yorktown, that he thought still that the country depended on its connection with America for the very existence of Britain. He said, "Take away America, and we would sink into perfect insignificance. It was the brightest jewel in the crown." Well, doesn't that make us feel special? The king, too. The king is very reluctant to give it up. In fact, he tells John Adams after the war, "I was the last to give it up." And in January 1782, this is 3 months after Yorktown, he argues that the loss of America would annihilate the rank in which the British Empire stands among the European states. Lord North, who still is prime minister at this point, argues for continuing the struggle even after Yorktown. He says it ought to rouse us into action. It ought to impel and urge and animate us. For by bold and united exertions, everything may be saved. Well, this is a pipe dream at this point. Lord Camden in the House of Lords observes, as he puts it, almost every power in Europe which is not declared against us were nevertheless in a state nearly approaching to actual hostility. The whole world has turned against Britain at this point. They've shot their wad. The body politic is tired of war. And as is typical of most wars, one side outlasts the other. In January 1783, Joseph II, who's become the monarch of Austria, declares that Britain could no longer be considered one of the first rank powers of Europe. And this is exactly what the British have been trying to avoid, sliding down the ladder into insignificance, as the king fears, in Europe. Well, what are the lessons we draw out of the revolution that might have some relevance today? I already mentioned the bromide that war never goes the way you think it's going to go. Equally important, I think, is the best team usually wins. Britain since 1763 has been alone, having alienated her neighbors with overbearing commercial and military policies. She is utterly bereft of allies, except for tiny Portugal, and even Lisbon is going to throw her over before the war ends. The historian Brendan Sims wrote that Britain in the Revolution was, quote, more isolated than she has ever been in her history. 1940 not accepted. 1940, they at least have the Greeks on their side. And what's more, there's a popular conviction in Britain that standing alone is a national badge of honor. In fact, being friendless was an intellectual and conceptual failure. History teaches us, and I am certain of this, that in war, it is usually the best team that wins, like the 60 nations who joined our alliance in World War II, the United Nations, small u, small n, as President Roosevelt called them. And I'll say it directly. Think of that as we give a thumb in the eye to our closest friends today. And during the revolution, that combat theater expands from North America to the wider world, to those 4 continents, to the 7 seas. And a parochial squabble on the far rim of civilization, excuse the expression, becomes this global war. So lesson number 3 at this point, beyond that, I think as a general rule, those fighting a counterinsurgency, those trying to extinguish a rebellion, have to win the war. That was true for us, fighting counterinsurgencies, waging counterinsurgencies in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. But the insurgents, the rebels, especially fighting on their own turf, often with support from the civilian population, they have to not lose. That was true in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and it was true for American rebels during the Revolution. Washington, who is not a particularly capable tactical commander, he doesn't really see the battlefield spatially and temporally the way a great captain like Napoleon or Grant does. But he does come to recognize, even though he is inherently extraordinarily aggressive, he comes to recognize that he needs to adopt what today we would call the strategic defensive. He's playing rope-a-dope, looking for opportunities to nick and bleed the British and the Germans where he can, but for the most part, just trying to keep his army from extermination, because if the army is exterminated, the cause is probably exterminated. So he has to not lose. The British have to win. And that's relevant today. And then the last lesson that I would cite is my good friend David Petraeus says that if you get the big ideas wrong in war, it's hard to get the rest of it to go right. And the British have the big ideas wrong. For example, they believe that superior firepower will cow the rebels. That when the first whiff of gunpowder will cause in Massachusetts will cause the other 12 colonies to basically throw up their hands and abandon Massachusetts. Quite the opposite happens. They bind together, and in the Carolinas, in Virginia, and the rest of the colonies that will become states in 1776, they basically take the attitude, if it can happen to them in Massachusetts, it can happen to us. That's one idea the British have wrong. Second, they believe there's a substantial silent majority of loyalists, and we know that to be wrong. Modern scholarship shows that about 20% of 2 million white Americans are loyal to the crown in a substantial way. That is never enough. It is never the majority that the king and his cabinet and parliament believe exist, waiting just to be teased out of their hovels to rise up and support the British Army. And then, what I think is maybe the most significant wrong idea, they believe that successfully detaching America from the British Empire will encourage insurrections in Ireland, Canada, those sugar islands in the West Indies, India, and dominoes will topple. Britain will then fall from the front ranks of European nations. Excuse me. This is disputed by some smart guys in Britain, including Edmund Burke and Adam Smith, the Scottish political philosopher whose Wealth of Nations is published in 1776. Smith says, you don't need this mercantilist system that you have set up to get where you want to go. You can do it with international trade, with or without tariffs. And the king and his men simply just don't want to hear it. They don't believe it. The American secretary, George Germain, tells the House of Commons in 1781 that Britain depends upon its links to America for Britain's very existence. And again, he talks about this brightest jewel in the crown. This is wrong. And there's going to be another jewel in the crown eventually, isn't there? It's called India, when the second British Empire emerges. We've not talked about military leadership yet, and I'll just say in passing that the British cause is generally not served well by the generals and admirals sent here to fight the war. Some, like General Amherst, who played a large role in the 7 Years' War, refused to participate in war against their erstwhile American allies. And others are just not up to the task. There are some capable British officers here, but they tend not to be the guys running the war. And so we have a sequence of duds, Gage and William Howe and Clinton, who are just not, they don't have the right stuff. The American rebels have some gifted leaders who show adaptability, durability, pertinacity, commitment to a cause larger than themselves. Washington, of course, although, as I mentioned, he's not a particularly good tactician. Nathaniel Greene, who's second only to Washington as the indispensable man. Uh, Big there in Providence, I know, Karin. Henry Knox is 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller. Washington has got an excellent eye for subordinate talent, intuits that this guy, somehow he intuits, is going to be the father of American artillery. And Daniel Morgan and John Stark and John Glover and Anthony Wayne, Lafayette, of course, contributes quite a lot to the cause. And the last one I'll mention, we shouldn't overlook him, Benedict Arnold. He's the best tactical commander on either side the first couple of years of the war. Obviously, he's got issues. They're going to emerge later in the war. So I'll stop there and open it up to questions and comments, whatever you think, Karin.
Thank you, Rick. So interesting. I have so many notes.
No, no, good.
So I'm going to start with a question that comes from my friend Al Dahlberg, which is to ask you about when the next book is going to be out. It's you just finished.
Yeah, that's
But
planted
you're
by
on
the
quite a
publisher, isn't it?
pace. Seriously, like it's amazing. I mean, that the fate of the day is only 5 years from the British are coming. These are serious. This is a lot. This is a serious work of scholarship in 5 years. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I can see the papers of George Washington behind you, so I
Yeah,
know you're like deep into work here.
yeah.
Um, so
Not deep enough yet, because the fate of the day came out in late April, and it's been
yeah,
almost exactly a year now. I've been flogging it, basically shilling.
yeah.
But I am at
But
work, and
you've been talking about the American Revolution too. You did such a fantastic job with the Burns documentary, and you've been on the road for that too.
yeah, thank you. Well, the first two volumes each took 6 years, and I'm older and
Hmm.
slower, so this one's not going to be any quicker. And not only do I have the papers of Washington back there, the papers of Greene, the papers of
Oh,
Cornwallis,
oh,
not to mention all that secondary stuff. My books to get list is 2,500 titles, and that just counts the papers of George Washington as one title. I think I have to pick up with volume 28 for my third volume, and they're now publishing volume 37 or 38. The end is in sight for UVA,
yes,
which has been
yeah, amazing.
curating
60
those.
years. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been an extraordinary project. They've done such a great job, but they see the end. I do not see the end, so it'll be a while yet.
All right. Excellent. I mean, my laptop is resting on a couple of volumes of the papers of Nathaniel Greene right here. Volume two, in fact, I'm very interested in his correspondence with his wife in those first two volumes. Very
She's
interesting.
fantastic, isn't she? She's,
Yes.
I mean, right to
Hmm.
the, I've been to, we should mention, he's such a tragic figure, isn't he, Karin? I mean, he ends the war broke.
Yeah.
Georgia gives him a couple of
Oh,
plantations
yeah.
for his service to the cause, and so this guy from Rhode Island, this lapsed Quaker, becomes a planter in Georgia. He
Oh,
buys
nice.
slaves.
Yeah.
And in 1786, he's out in the fields, and on a hot June day,
Yeah.
he keels over with sunstroke and dies. And
Yeah.
so he's not around to be where he should be, which is taking part in the Constitutional Convention, to perhaps be part of Washington's cabinet, to be one of the founders when the new republic
Yeah.
starts. It's a great law. He's buried in, as you know, in Savannah. So anyway,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a loss. Okay, so let's talk about Rhode Island here for a minute. I've got a lot of questions for you, but um, well, let me hold on the Rhode Island question first and ask you about. You talked about war is such a great revealer of character, and if war is almost the steady state of humanity in some really depressing way, what can you say about the impact of war on ordinary soldiers? Like, what can we say about kind of trauma of the war, especially given the intimate quality of combat that you describe, the way that combat has to take place up close and personal to create such violence person to person, but also the way that the enemy, whether the enemy is the Americans or the enemy is the British, depending on where you are, the enemy is also really ensconced in these populations. They're occupying cities, they're marauding through countrysides to, feed and house themselves. What's the trauma effect of
Yeah,
all of
that's
this?
a great question, and it's a hard question to answer in part because, I mean, we assume, don't we, that there's got to be some PTSD at play here,
Mm,
but they don't have the vocabulary to describe it or to understand it. We haven't had it until relatively recently,
mm,
and we've had to relearn it. Shell shock in World War One, we have some idea of how to treat shell shock, but then we forget between the world
yeah,
wars, and it has to be learned again during World War II, and a different vocabulary comes up with different terminology and so on, and different treatments for it. And again, World War II ends. We've had 16.4 million Americans in uniform in World War II. Hundreds of thousands of them have seen terrible things.
mm,
Uh, and we know anecdotally that it has affected some of them for the rest of their lives. Again, the treatment for it is not good. The cultural acknowledgement of it is nil, essentially. The war's over, get on with your life, go get a
yeah,
job, buy a house, move to the suburbs, and all the rest of it. So I assume, I think most people who think about it assume that there is a PTSD factor as a consequence of those who are involved in close combat in the revolution. It's really hard to tease out of the historical record afterward. It's really hard to say, okay, this private, in the 4th Connecticut Regiment, just seems to be adrift in his life afterwards, and to attribute that to what he has to find the correlation to what he has experienced in the war. Obviously, there are people who are going to be adrift, but would they have been adrift otherwise?
yeah,
There's a lot of drifters that are soldiers in the revolution. That's part of the army that has to be forged. I think it's largely hypothetical. It's a great object for somebody it's a great PhD dissertation for somebody, I think, to really try and find correlations. Um, I would say only that I think culturally, the general attitude is okay, it's over,
mm,
get on with it. Get on with your life. Get on with the making of the new republic. Well, we got a lot of problems to solve. The problems are bottomless. You got a family to raise. You've got problems of your own. Just trying to pick the country up off the mat in 1783 is a big job. And I suspect there's very little sympathy for those who can't show the diligence, the fortitude to move ahead.
yeah,
And so there's probably, to the extent that there are psychic wounds, I'm sure there are, they probably are quite hidden. It's a
yeah.
dark secret.
Yeah. Let me ask you, I mean, I'm so interested in how you go about this work and what kinds of sources you use, but I wanted to ask you about one particular type, which is how you get at the questions of not the George Washingtons or the Nathaniel Greens, for whom we have these beautiful published documentary editions, but for ordinary soldiers. We have a fantastic diary that was just gifted to the JCB just about 18 months ago of a Massachusetts kid, Samuel Harris. The diary covers him from August to late October of 1777. He, of course, goes to Saratoga. And what he writes about mostly in the diary is like, we had to go out and find breakfast. Then we like went and stole some apples and we got in
Yeah,
trouble.
yeah,
And, then he has these passages where he says, like, we were told to move to the left. And this is literally there's one section, one day he writes this. We were told to move to the left. Then we were told to move to the right. Then we were told to move to the left. And then we were told to the right.
Welcome
And
to the
then,
army, soldier.
it's kind of amazing. Like there's something very moving about how he writes every single day, these completely pedestrian kinds of experiences. But I wonder when you're talking about like war is a great revealer of character. can you get at the character of the ordinary soldier who's being told to move to the left and move to the right, in any way? Or are you reading through that experience of logistical nightmare, of, kind of the chaos? Like, how do you get to that kind of character question?
Yeah, well, obviously the bold-faced names are easier because
Mm,
they've left a record, and just as you know better than I, there's so many who leave no footprints,
mm,
and that includes almost all blacks, 500,000 blacks. That includes most of the women in the country. That's half of
yeah.
the other 2 million whites. That includes Native Americans. It includes indigents. There are many subcategories of people that really don't leave a record or leave a very faint record. So trying to tease it out is difficult. Obviously, there are pension records. The country belatedly began offering a sequence of pensions, and there are thousands of those around. I use them, but I'm a little wary of them because it's so
Mm,
far removed from their actual experience in the war.
mm,
What the first pension records are in 1819. The first pensions offer 1819, and they don't really swing into it for another decade after that.
yeah.
So these guys are pretty old by that point. And so I'm a little wary, when they talk about exactly what they did in 1778 at wherever,
Mm,
Monmouth or wherever. But they're there. There are letters that are, real time, and that's more relevant, I think, to really trying to get a sense of who they are and how they're affected and so on, how their characters are evolving. Um, uh, and the repositories are the repositories of the New York Historical, and they're the pilgrimage to Ann Arbor for the wonderful library,
mm,
the Clements Library there, and I spend a lot of time in the British National Archive in Kew. I did for World War II, and I certainly have for the Revolution, because you can find the correspondence that tells you a lot about the other side of the hill, which always
mm,
fascinates me. Um, but I think, to see, in real detail how an individual is changing, I've got to look at Franklin, or I've got to look at Washington, or I've got to look at Greene.
mm.
The reason I can look at them is because they left an enormous record.
Yeah.
Uh,
And we kept it.
and we kept it, and they made sure that we kept it. Washington had a dragoons protecting his papers because he wanted to be sure that the history was recorded. And I recognize that that is not, it doesn't speak universally to the issue, but
Mm,
it's still uh, important, I think. And it's, you do the best you can again.
mm. A great question from Jennifer Moore of WGBH, who says, "Thanks, Rick. Interesting to hear about parallels and lessons. What letter grade would you give American journalism in its use of historical parallels while covering modern conflicts? And how could journalists do this better?"
Oh, well, my friend Jennifer, of course you would have to. Thank you, Jennifer. Uh, I was a journalist for a long time, a small paper in Southeast Kansas, and then Kansas City, and then the Washington Post. And I would say, what letter grade? Maybe a gentleman's C, a gentlewoman's C. Uh, Journalists tend to be caught up in the moment and don't have the time or the inclination to reflect or to draw on history very often. I think it's pretty unusual for a journalist to do that. And history, today we see in Iran, people looking back at the Iran-Iraq War. That's history, right? Well, that wasn't that long ago. um, or they're looking at the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91, and that's really not history. Um, how useful is it? I cited some things that I think should be in the backs of the minds of people writing about war today, including the fact that it never goes the way you think it's going to go. You think these guys in Washington know what they're doing right now? They don't know what they're doing right now. That seems evident to me. It should seem evident to everyone. I think it's evident in Tehran. And you can look at wars that go sideways and almost anticipate that this one's going to go sideways in some fundamental way. It already has, because it's now gone on for more than a month, and a lot of people are dying in Iran, and increasing numbers in Israel and elsewhere. So, that's a very good question. Thankfully, I'm a recovering journalist, so I don't need to think about it very much, but I want you to think about it, Jennifer.
Excellent journalist, always thoughtful. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jennifer. That was a
so
great
true.
question. Yeah. So let me ask you another question about how you approach telling the story of the revolution, which is that you describe yourself and other people describe you as a narrative historian, which means you're telling a linear story. But sometimes you're reflecting on the loops, not necessarily getting us from point A to point B, or, from year one to year two or whatever, that you're really thinking about how there are these recursions in the historical, experience. Can you describe how you think about that in your mind? Is it linear? Is it multidimensional? Are you thinking about those recursive loops? How does this war sometimes can seem to someone reading a narrative account can seem linear, but I don't think that's how you're imagining it, seeing it, or writing it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. First of all, I think if you're a nonfiction writer, you stray from chronology at your peril. It's your
Mm,
best friend. And it's not that you need to be a slave to the calendar, but it's how events unfold. They unfold there, and then, and then, and then.
mm,
So I'm very aware of that. I'm trying to, and I always have in writing about war, to use the military's lingo for this. I'm telling a story that's strategic, that's operational, and that's tactical. And what that means, tactical is the grunt's eye view. It is, the view from a foxhole. It's the view of what's happening at the moment. Operational is a larger view of the battlefield. It might be Washington's point of view, or Cornwallis's, or Clinton's, or Franklin's. Again, because I'm always trying to get away from the battlefield. I'm looking for opportunities to go to Paris or Versailles, looking for opportunities to go to London. I would be looking for opportunities to go to Madrid.
mm,
Um, uh, Partly because I think the reader needs relief from the battlefield. I've
mm,
always felt that way. I felt that way in writing about World War II. And then strategic is at the highest level. It's the biggest arrows on the map. And it's how Congress is looking at it. It's the strategic evolution. And Washington, by necessity, is operating on all three levels. He's actually out there with his sword drawn in the middle of tactical fights, but then he's deciding where he's going to be moving his army and his regiments. And then, because there's no Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Congress is not particularly capable of thinking in strategic terms, particularly when it comes to war, he's got to be the chief strategist so he's operating on all three. So I'm trying to tell that story uh, as it's drifting through time chronologically, but also moving between these three levels, up and down and back and so on. And then added to that, I'm trying to tell the story through characters.
mm,
And I have the, uh, the good fortune to have the same cast of characters who've come onto the stage in volume one. And for the most part, they're with us all the way through. That includes King George and George Germain and Lord North on the other side, but those bold-faced names on the American side. And I'm trying to tell the story through their eyes. I'm trying to, for one thing, to dispute the cartoonish view of George III and the cartoonish view of the British as stupid lobsterbacks who don't know enough to stand behind a tree while they're fighting. That's just historically inaccurate. And so I think trying to tell the story, humanizing it by telling it through characters is part of what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you, Rick. And thank you for this time. I want to just make one last comment, which is that I, of course, when I read, I'm always taking notes, and I am especially making notes about great writing. And also, of course, I was very attentive to your several pages in which you treat late summer of 1778 and the battle for Newport and the situation in Rhode Island. But I have a little star by this point that you say war had lacerated Newport. It's such an amazingly vivid sentence that so puts in your mind exactly what's happening in that place and time. And I just adore that. And I want to just thank you for writing these books that are so substantial, but also put us in a place that we can visualize. It's really a remarkable thing. Anyway.
Well, thank you for that, Karin. And by the way, my plan is to start volume 3 back in Newport.
Oh, then we're in favor of that. But make sure you should come a little further north,
Of course, I'd like to do that. But with the French coming to Newport, it's in the summer of 1780. That's a great way, I think, to start the final act of this saga.
Well, couldn't have had a better way to wind this wonderful hour with you. Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Karin. Great to see you.
Okay,
Thank you.
such a pleasure. All right, take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.